So I have been working on this 5-hour behemoth of a video series that is coming very, very soon. If you're wondering what topic is so dense that it calls for an unholy 5 hours of content, there are some painfully on the nose hints in this video if you pay attention. This video itself is actually a subject that I was going to touch on in that series, but it just wasn't really slotting into the script the way I wanted it to. But it's still worth talking about. So here it is in a mini episode all its own. Kata, otherwise known as forms. Do they suck? I'm going to be honest with you. I kind of agree with the consensus on this that yes, they do. Like and subscribe to the channel, and I'll see you next time. So, obviously, I have more to say than that. Kata, as we typically imagine them, are sets of techniques that are done solo. The major criticism of these kata is that they really have zero bearing in terms of actual fighting skills. Now, I do think for complete beginners, kata are actually sort of okay. A lot of the people making this criticism of kata are at least somewhat experienced in a martial art. And I think, myself included, by the way, that we forget a lot of people come to the martial arts having done little to no athletics. Like, ever. For raising people up to a base level of fitness and teaching people some basic techniques without the stress of being bodied by a partner, well, I think kata fill that niche fairly well. But because of this stance, I don't think most systems need more than maybe 3-ish kata. You certainly don't need like 30 or whatever. And look, if you're doing kata as a feat of athleticism or as a performative art, all the power to you. Those are both perfectly valid things. Before I do hop into the meat and potatoes, though, I want to take a second to say that if you have any serious interest in kata, or even a passing interest, really, Ian Abernathy over on the Practical Bunkai YouTube channel is kind of the kata guy. I'm sure Jesse Incamp has some too on his karate channel. I'm not always sure I agree 100% with what Ian has to say on everything, but he always presents his arguments intelligently and holistically. At the risk of rehashing some of his great content, I'm going to briefly do a rundown on the original point of kata. Originally, kata existed as a sort of living martial arts manual. It was something you practiced to essentially program an art's core curriculum into your muscle memory. And that's great. But the problem with this living flash drive approach is that everything around martial arts has changed since this idea was originally conceived. More openness in martial arts culture, the printing press, film, and definitely the sharing ability of the internet have kind of turned this function of kata into a relic, into a legacy technology. That doesn't mean you can't interpret some useful things out of kata, but their original function is mostly outdated. This problem is only compounded by the fact that they tend to be implemented into martial arts systems pretty poorly. There's no thread that runs through kata into live sparring, and while I certainly don't want to oversimplify the Practical Bunkai channel's central thesis, that is kind of what Ian Abernathy over there is trying to rectify. To me, though, this is a tough proposition for a lot of reasons, kind of beyond the scope of this short video. Basically, I think this type of kata is useful for building up couch potato hobbyist types early in their career, and I think they still will always be nice demonstration pieces. And no, I don't care what the internet says. Martial arts will always need some aesthetic flash to show off to laymen because that's just how you pull in a lot of new clientele. You got to keep the lights on. There is a place for aesthetics in martial arts. It's just far from a priority in live sparring sessions is all. Alright, cool. So why make this video if I'm just going to recite the consensus position back at you that you've probably heard a million times? Well, my major contention to the popular view on kata changes a lot when we talk about paired kata, forms we do with a partner. Now, sometimes paired kata kind of fill the same role as solo kata, where they serve mostly as a database of techniques and central principles. Judo's Nage no kata is very much like that, and I'm not really talking about those kinds of forms. I'm talking about paired kata as the first step in a system of learning. You see, in Japan at least, a lot of the safety equipment we take for granted these days really didn't come into existence until fairly recently. Things like padded gloves, bamboo swords, protective gear, and even mats themselves are really only 1 or 200 years old. By the way, when I say mats, I mean specifically mats for martial arts training. Mats for inside homes existed far longer than that. And I know 200 years sounds old, but consider martial arts had been being taught in formalized schools for 3 to 5 centuries before those safety developments. Most training was done outdoors or on hard wood, and if weapons were involved, and they often were, they were usually made out of hardwood themselves. Don't get me wrong, getting clubbed in the head is certainly better than decapitation, but it was still a suboptimal outcome, especially because you're supposed to be training repeatedly. You would just be getting concussed left and right. This situation put teachers in a bit of a predicament. How could they teach students without maiming them every practice? The answer, or at least the first step towards a complete solution, were paired kata. To explain this, let's look at a hypothetical made up martial arts school. We'll call it Fedora Tipping Katana no Jutsu because while you were out partying, we were studying the blade. Let's say in this martial art, presumably filled with virgins that smell like Axe body spray and have bad facial hair, there are 5 kata. A new student would come in and learn them sequentially just like you'd expect. But remember, these are paired kata. So when you do them with your teacher, if you mess up, he would almost certainly let you know somehow, typically with a bonk to whatever opening you created when you made the error. Over time, the speed and intensity of these kata would pick up, and all 5 of them would eventually flow together. In other words, rather than doing one kata and then stopping, pausing, and doing the next kata, you would flow right into the next kata without stopping, essentially making all 5 kata one big super kata. And all of this is step 1. Step 2 is where things get interesting, because now your teacher might not perform the kata sequentially. Maybe he starts with 1, but then follows it with 3, and then 4, and then back to 1, and then 5, and then so on and so forth. Just based on the first movement, you, as the student, need to recognize which kata you're performing and react appropriately. And once again, failure would result in getting bopped with a wooden sword much of the time. This whole process, again, will slowly build in speed and intensity until you are ready for step 3, which, of course, is even more complicated. Now, your teacher might not only ignore the kata's numerical sequence, but also the technique order in each individual kata. So, for example, say kata 1 has 5 moves in it. Your teacher might start halfway through that kata on move 3, and you need to react properly. And then he could skip to kata 3, move 7 of 10, and you need to pick up right there. All, once again, under the threat of physical punishment and with ever increasing intensity. I hope you see where this is going by now. With every step, your understanding of each kata needs to be more and more granular, all while the training itself becomes increasingly spontaneous and almost random. Eventually, the idea is that you no longer need to consciously think about where you are in the kata at all. Your brain isn't sitting there thinking, okay, this is kata 4, move 6, I need to do X, Y, and Z. Instead, your body has just done it so many times that it begins to react on its own. At that point, you move into step 4, which is true, blue, live sparring. This method of slowly phasing out structure allowed teachers to build students up without just literally killing them by tossing them into live sessions right off the bat. This is neat, but it still seems worse than what we do today, right? The answer to this, I think, is yes and no. On one hand, this is worse because it takes a lot of discipline and dedication from a student across a long period of time. It is a very difficult way to market to incoming students who are ostensibly joining up because they want to do the live stuff right now, as soon as possible. It's just a different market than it was in 1700s Japan, and most people aren't really willing to commit to this slow burn style of learning. And safety equipment, for sure, invalidates a lot of this method. We have protective equipment and mats now, something that was genuinely revolutionary when it first came out. And we can now, at least within reason, spar with beginners and not have to be concerned with them getting murdered. On the other hand, though, we do actually still use parts of this method. Positional drilling, pad work, and so on are all kind of just steps 2 and 3. They show you a common situation pulled out of a live session, and you literally drill responses into muscle memory. Make no mistake, things like position drills and pad work are a form of kata. Major issue isn't that this older method of teaching is old unto itself. It's just implemented poorly and probably isn't fast enough for the modern consumer. Most schools will show you the static step 1 and then never draw any connection to live sparring at all. This makes kata just sort of feel tacked on in their own separate thing. So much so that I doubt most teachers really know how to even transform those kata into live skills over time, even if they wanted to. Plus, a lot of paired kata are often developed by a new style for that style, without the learning system in mind. This tends to make them incompatible with the learning system because each paired kata has to be able to flow into the rest of them at any given move. Paired kata can't really be arbitrarily designed if you're using them as the base of that old traditional pedagogical method. So this is neat and all, but why care? Even if we kind of do stealth kata in modern training, and even if this is an effective, albeit time consuming piece of pedagogy, it's still kind of a museum exhibit, right? Technically, it has utility in the same way Model T car could still get you from place to place, but certainly and definitely inferior to modern vehicles, right? And the answer is yes, except in one very niche scenario, I think. And that is the dark arts of standing joint locks. Standing joint locks are this really weird, fuzzy part of any martial arts system. On one hand, you have guys that will swear up and down that this stuff is like just too dangerous for MMA and weird things like that. I disagree with that notion, but it is worth saying that almost every grappling art out there has banned them. BJJ is a notable exception, but hasn't really been an issue in that sport. Most popular commentary will say this is because these kinds of locks just don't really work. And I disagree with that too. Biomechanically, they are sound. Just in a compliant situation, have someone apply some of these to you and make sure you trust that person because they undeniably hurt. I maintain that the reason you don't see these kinds of techniques appear too frequently is twofold. First, most grappling sports have indeed banned them, so none of those sports are dedicating time to developing them live because it's time better spent elsewhere. And second, pretty much any tutelage you get on these types of locks are devoid of setup. It's just sort of, yeah, your partner compliantly lets you get into a position and then you apply it and then you're done. To make matters worse, standing joint locks are widely misunderstood. A lot of martial arts teach them as throws, but falls really only happen when the person being locked willingly chooses to fall. It's not a forced takedown like a single leg or a hip throw. Joint locks in a standing position are essentially the same as joint locks on the ground. They typically don't result in an irresistible fall or move. Taking a fall is just an option you exclusively have in the standing position. It's either that or you tap out. But the other wrinkle in all this is that standing joint locks are really, really tough to train live, both repeatedly and safely. On the ground, mostly because there's nowhere for our partners to go, we can slowly, gradually apply joint pressure. In standing, though, the person being attacked with a joint lock can move much more freely, and that basically turns applying a lock into a race. Can you snap it on before the other person can escape? And the answer is yes, you can do that. You can train for that. That is possible. But it also means there is no middle ground for standing joint locks. It is either a failed technique or a hyperextended joint, especially if your partner refuses to fall or has no idea it's coming. There is a very nasty Shinya Aoki clip that demonstrates this exact thing that I'll put in the description. I'm not clipping it in here because I've seen it like 8 or 12 times, and seeing a dude's arm bend that way makes me cold sweat every time. This, incidentally, is the same issue with wrist locks, by the way, and why so many people hate them. They come on fast, out of nowhere, and they sort of have to, or they're dead in the water. A lot of people who don't know anything about anything interpret this as those techniques being like bad manners or someone willfully trying to hurt you, but they've got to put it on fast, man. Like, I don't know what to tell you. If you don't put it on fast, people escape. That's just how it is. Which brings me full circle back to paired kata. Because we have this issue with injury in standing joint locks, in which mats or protective gear don't really solve, the next best solution is the old pedagogical method, slowly building up from very static, very compliant building blocks and gradually phasing into live training. This should teach partners how to safely apply and react to standing locks and minimize injury, all while putting these techniques in a much needed setup context that is all too often lacking. Now, whether or not you think seeking out a teacher who could do this for you is worth it, all for the relatively niche category of standing joint locks, that's really down to you. For most people, probably not going to be worth it, but you never know. All right, that's it for now. Goofy large video project coming very soon, hopefully next week sometime. The editing is about 40% done, so it should be doable, but I'm not making any promises. As you have probably recognized at this point, my upload schedule is, well, calling it a schedule is pretty lenient. If you like this content and you want to help support me making it, maybe motivate me to post more often, do the things that you know you need to do. All right, I will catch you next time.